March 2026, American carrier strike groups are positioned in the Persian Gulf. Israel F-35s are conducting strikes deep inside Iranian territory. Iranian ballistic missiles are lighting up the night sky over the Strait of Hormuz. The world is watching the most dangerous military confrontation since the Cold War unfold in real time. And, and 6,000 kilometers away, in a glass-walled office in Beijing, a man is smiling. Not because China wants war, not because China engineered this conflict, but because every single day this war continues, every missile fired, every choke point disrupted, every alliance strained, China's strategic position improves. Quietly, systematically, without firing a single shot. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington, Tel Aviv, or Tehran wants to say out loud. In every war, there is a battlefield, and then there is a beneficiary. The battlefield is the Middle East in this war. The beneficiary is China in this war. This is the story of how the most consequential geopolitical conflict of the 21st century is being won. Not by the nation doing the fighting, but by the nation watching it most carefully. But before we get to China, we need to understand what this war is actually destroying. Because this conflict is not just a military story, it is an economic story, a geography story, a story about the invisible architecture of the global order that the United States spent 80 years building, and that is now being dismantled piece by piece in the Persian Gulf. Think about what America built after World War II. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Every barrel of oil on earth is priced in dollars. Every nation that wants oil must first acquire dollars. Every nation that holds dollars must park them in US Treasury bonds. This single arrangement, the petrodollar system, gave the United States a structural advantage over every other economy on earth for 8 decades. America also built the security architecture of the Middle East, bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. The Fifth Fleet permanently stationed in the Gulf. Security guarantees to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, and the Gulf states. A web of alliances and dependency that kept the region's energy flowing and flowing in dollars. And underpinning all of it, the credibility of American power, the belief held by every nation on earth that if you threaten American allies or American interests, there would be consequences. That architecture is now under the most severe stress it has ever faced. And China has a front row seat. Let's start with money. Because money is where China's advantage is most immediate and most measurable. The petrodollar system has one critical requirement. Oil must be priced in dollars, and for oil to be priced in dollars, the nations that produce and consume oil must trust the dollar enough to use it. The trust rests on one foundation: American dominance of the global financial system and American military credibility in the regions where oil is produced. Now, watch what the war is doing to both. Every day that American carrier groups are tied off in the Persian Gulf managing this conflict, they are not projecting power elsewhere. Every dollar spent on munitions, on naval operations, on intelligence assets in the Middle East is a dollar not spent on the Pacific. Every political capital consumed managing Israel Iranian escalation is political capital not available for building economic coalition against China. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is watching. Saudi Arabia, which signed a landmark agreement with China in 2023 to begin accepting yuan for oil sales, Saudi Arabia, which joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Saudi Arabia, which has been quietly, carefully, methodically building an alternative relationship with Beijing for years. The war accelerates this. When the Gulf states watch American military power concentrated in a conflict that is destabilizing their region, raising their insurance premiums, disrupting their shipping, and threatening their infrastructure, they ask a question. Is Washington's guarantee still worth what it used to be? Every day, the answer feels less certain. The yuan becomes a little more attractive. Here is a fact that almost never appears in the Western coverage of this conflict. China is the world's largest importer of oil. It buys approximately 10 to 11 million barrels per day from global markets. A significant portion of that comes from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from UAE, from Kuwait, and from Iran. Now, here is the question you need to sit with. If you are the world's largest oil importer and the region that supplies your oil suddenly erupted into the most dangerous military conflict in a generation, would that be a problem for you? The answer, counterintuitively, is not entirely. Because China has something nobody else has, a direct overland pipeline to Russia. The power of Siberia pipeline, operational since 2019 with power of Siberia 2 under negotiation, gives China access to Russian energy that bypass every maritime choke point on earth. No Hormuz, no Bab el Mandeb, no Red Sea, no Cape of Good Hope rerouting. And since Western sanctions pushed Russia to offer oil at steep discounts, sometimes $20 to $30 below market price, China has been buying Russian energy at a discount that its competitors cannot access. So while every other major economy, Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, is scrambling to reroute supply chains, paying 350% more for air freight, watching their energy cost spike, China is buying discounted Russian oil through a pipeline that no drone can reach. The war that is raising everyone else's energy cost is for China an energy arbitrage opportunity. Now let's talk about manufacturing because this is where China's advantage becomes truly structural. One of the most significant economic stories of the past 5 years has been the push to diversify global supply chains away from China, reshoring, friendshoring, the China plus one strategy, where companies keep some manufacturing in China but build alternative capacity in Vietnam, India, Mexico, or elsewhere. This diversification was working slowly, imperfectly, but it was working. And then the war happened. India, the single most important alternative to China in global manufacturing, suddenly finds itself navigating an air cargo crisis. Rates from Mumbai to New York are up to by 350%. The Gulf air corridors that Indian exporters relied to have collapsed by 79%. Sea freight through Hormuz is down by 97%. An Indian manufacturer trying to ship components to an American assembly plant on a just in time schedule is now facing delays, cost spikes, supply chain unpredictability that makes their pitch to global buyers significantly weaker. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers shift east. through Pacific corridors away from the Gulf entirely, unaffected by Hormuz, unaffected by Bab el Mandeb, unaffected by Houthi drones or Iranian missiles. The China plus one strategy assumed that alternatives to China would be viable, cost effective, and reliable. The war is systematically undermining all three assumptions for every alternative except China itself. Every global buyer who was considering shifting production from Shenzhen to Chennai is now looking at the numbers and asking, is this really the right moment? But perhaps China's most important gain is the one that does not show up in any economic data. It shows up on a map. In March, China brokered a historic diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the year of 2023. Two nations that had severed diplomatic relations in 2016. Two nations that had been engaged in a proxy war across the Middle East for a decade, brought to a handshake in Beijing. At the time, Western analysts debated whether it was significant or merely symbolic. The war has answered that question because now, as American and Israeli forces engage Iranian military infrastructure, China is positioned as the one major power that has relationships on every side of this conflict. Beijing has ties with Tehran. Iran is a partner in the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing has a growing economic relationship with Riyadh. Beijing has trade relations with Israel. Beijing has a relationship with Russia, which is supplying Iran with military technology. Washington, by contrast, is a combatant. American is not a broker in this conflict. It is participant. And participant cannot mediate. Participants cannot position themselves as the adults in the room when the room stops being on fire. China has spent years of building the credibility to say to every nation in the Middle East, we are not here to take sides, we are here to do business. That credibility, carefully constructed, patiently maintained, is now worth more than it has ever been. Now we come to the part of this story that makes defense analysts in the Washington lose sleep: Taiwan. The island that China considers a breakaway province, the island that produces 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the island that American strategic doctrine has committed ambiguously but consistently to defend. For years, the central question of Pacific security has been, would America actually intervene if China moves on Taiwan? And would America's intervention be credible enough to deter China from trying to in the first place? That calculation depends on one thing above all others: American military bandwidth. Right now, American carrier strikes groups are in the Persian Gulf. American munition stockpiles are being drawn down supplying Israel. American political attention is consumed by the most complex Middle Eastern crisis in a generation. American diplomatic capital is being spent managing alliance relationship in a region 6,000 miles from the Pacific. China is watching all of this, measuring it, calculating the bandwidth question with extraordinary precision. This is not speculation. Chinese military planners have a concept. They call it the moment of strategic opportunity, the window when the adversary's attention, resources, and credibility are maximally stressed. The question is the question that hangs over every conversation in Beijing right now is simple. Is this the window? Here is the nuances that makes the story genuinely complex. China is not cheering for this war. China is not supplying weapons to Iran, at least not openly. and not at a scale that would make Beijing a direct participant. China is not sabotaging American military operations. China is not making provocative moves in the Pacific while Washington is distracted because China does not need to. The war is doing the work by itself. Every dollar of damage to the global trading system is a dollar of damage to an architecture that America built and that China has been trying to reform for 20 years. Every strain on American alliances is a strain on the network of relationships that constrains Chinese ambition. Every disruption to the petrodollar system is a step toward the multipolar financial order that Beijing has been advocating since 2009. China's strategy is not to start fires, it is to be ready when the fires start themselves. Sun Lu, the Chinese military strategy, whose writing still shapes Chinese strategy thinking, wrote it 25 centuries ago. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. China is not fighting. China is not even pushing. China is simply waiting, watching, and position. Let's step back and look at this the way a business school professor would. Imagine you are studying a case study. Two companies are locked in a brutal, expensive, resource consuming conflict over market share in a particular region. They are spending billions on the fight. They are damaging each other's infrastructure. They are straining their relationship with suppliers and partners. They are exhausting their management bandwidth on a single battleground. And while they fight, a third competitor is quietly signing long term supply agreements with their customers, building alternative logistics routes, strengthening its balance sheet, and positioning itself as the reliable partner that neither combatant can be right now. Which company wins the decades? Which company wins the decade? Not the one that wins the battle, the one that was patient enough not to fight it. That is China's position in 2026. Not a mediator, not a combatant, a patient, systematic, extraordinary, well positioned third party, accumulating advantages that will compound for decades while the combatants counter their casualties. Now, to be fair, China has vulnerabilities in this story too, and, and intellectual honesty demands we acknowledge them. China still imports significant volumes of Gulf oil through maritime routes. A complete collapse of Red Sea or Hormuz shipping would hurt Chinese manufacturing inputs too, even with Russian pipeline supply as a partial buffer. China's Belt and Road investment in the Middle East, ports, infrastructure, loans carry political and financial risk in a wartime environment. And if this conflict triggers a broader global recession, which is real possibilities, China's export dependent economy would not be immune. The advantage is real, but it is not unlimited and it is not without risk. The question is not whether China wins perfectly, the question is whether China wins relatively, relative to the United States, relative to the Europe, relative to the existing global order. And on that question, the answer is becoming harder and harder to dispute. In 500 BC, the Greek historian Thucydides wrote about a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history. When a rising power challenges an established power, the conflict that follows is rarely won by the strongest army or the biggest economy. It is won by the nation with the clearest long term strategy. The nation that can absorb short term disruption while accumulating long term structural advantage. The United States spent 80 years building the most sophisticated geopolitical architecture in human history. The dollar, the alliances, the military presence, the trading system. It is an extraordinary achievement. But architectures have a weakness. They require maintenance, they require attention, they require the nation at the center to remain focused on the whole system, not just the loudest crisis within it. The war in the Middle East is the loudest crisis on earth right now. And while the world watches the loudest crisis, China is working on the architecture. Not with missiles, not with provocations, with pipelines and currency agreements and diplomatic relationships and patient, systematic long-term positioning. Sun Tzu said the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. America and Israel and Iran are fighting. China is practicing the supreme art. And in 20 years, when historians write the account of how the 21st century's global order was determined, the chapter on 2026 US, Israel, and Iran war will not be about the missiles of over Hormuz. It will be about who was watching and what they did while everyone else was looking the other way.